Hi everyone, I'm Mike Preston, Technical Marketing Architect here at Rubrik, and welcome to a series of videos where we're covering off everything from Rubrik and GraphQL. Thus far, we've talked a little bit about why we made the move to GraphQL and showed you how to fetch data using GraphQL queries. If you're uncomfortable with any of those topics, I definitely recommend going back and watching a couple of videos before this. Today, however, we're going to move along and we're actually going to look at how we can actually trigger off workflows using Rubrik and GraphQL with a concept called GraphQL mutations. So with that, let's dive in. All right, so GraphQL mutations. These are our keys or our entry points into modifying server-side data. In other words, mutations are how we kick off all the familiar Rubrik workflows, such as assigning an SLA domain or taking an on-demand snapshot. Really, any time that we need to modify data within the Rubrik platform or trigger a rubric to perform a certain function, we use mutations. Now, mutations are formed much in the same way queries are. First, we declare our mutation with the mutation syntax. And just like queries, we can define an operation name as well. Then we specify the mutation that we'd like to use, and of course pass in all of the required information that the mutation needs in order to execute. And just like queries, mutations often respond with some sort of data. We can see here we've set a mutation that will update the score of a game. Our mutation performed the action and responded with some information back to us. And just like queries, mutations support the ability to add variables and attributes as well. So with all that said, let's get more Rubrik specific here and explore one of the most commonly automated Rubrik tasks, taking an on-demand snapshot. Alright, so we're back in our GraphQL playground. Now let's take a look at the documentation and see if we can't figure out how to take an on-demand snapshot. If I just start to search here for vSphere on demand, we can see the mutation that's shown. So let's drill into that and see what information we need to gather. So it looks like we need to get the ID of the VM that we wish to process, as well as the ID of the SLA domain we want to apply to the on-demand snapshot. So before we can perform our mutation, we need to write a couple of queries to get this info. Thankfully, I already have these written, so let's just run this, and we'll start with the VM. So we'll run the VM one here, and we can see that we could just grab the ID of our virtual machine. I'll take this one here, and I'll place it into our query variables below, so we can use that for later. Now, in terms of the SLA domains, we have another query here that we can execute, so let's go ahead and do that. And for an SLA, let me go ahead and take the ID for the global VM SLA we have defined here. And again, we'll paste that into our query variables. So now that we have the two pieces of required information we need, let's begin creating our mutation. So we'll start with our mutation keyword, and then we'll give it an operation name. Let's call it take snapshot. Now, we want to take in the variables that we just defined, so we're going to go ahead and define them here as well. So looking at the documentation, it appears that the VM needs to be a type UUID and the SLA ID is a string. So we'll just put that information into our constructor here. Now we need to specify the mutation that we want to leverage. In our case, vSphere on-demand snapshot. So we'll put that information in. And now finally, let's pass it all of that required information that it needs. So the snappable FID is our VM ID. And the SLA ID is going to be our $SLA ID variable. And finally, we can now specify what fields we want it to return. So we can see our return type is a request status. So let's drill into that. Okay, now we can see all of the fields available. So let's say we want it to return just the ID and maybe the status for now. All right. So time to execute, and there we go. We've sent the request through and our on-demand snapshot has begun. If we wanted, we could take this output and write another query to go ahead and get the status of the task. So that's really it for mutations. Honestly, if you understand queries, mutations really aren't that far off. And like queries, they support variables, arguments, and fragments, and they're used to trigger off workflows within the Rubrik Security Cloud. In our next video, we'll leave the Rubrik GraphQL playground behind us and start exploring how we can consume Rubrik GraphQL with one of our most widely adopted languages, PowerShell. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you soon.